A castle wall is far more than a stack of stones. It is a tapestry woven with the very identity of its builders, a hidden language of faith, power, and superstition set in mortar. We often picture these medieval fortresses as monolithic grey structures, but their construction was far more bizarre and symbolic than you might think. This journey will unveil 31 of the most peculiar substances ever embedded within castle walls, from crushed seashells that invoke divine protection to animal blood offered as a spiritual sacrifice. By the end, you will be able to look at any ancient fortress and see the secret messages its builders left behind. What did it mean to mix human hair into the clay, or to seal a foundation with a holy relic? The answers reveal a world where every stone told a story. What does the strength of a fortress truly rest upon? The shimmering dust of crushed seashells, ground from treasures of the deep, was the first secret ingredient mixed into the medieval mason's mortar. Picture a craftsman at his bench, patiently grinding these iridescent fragments into a fine, pearlescent powder. He was not creating a simple building paste. He was weaving a prayer directly into the fortress walls. This material was sacred. For centuries, the scallop shell served as the universal symbol of pilgrimage, most famously worn by travelers on the long, arduous journey to the shrine of St. James in Santiago de Compostela. By embedding these shells into the very foundation, builders were invoking that same spiritual journey and divine protection for everyone within. They were consecrating the castle, turning it into a literal house of faith blessed by the heavens. Of course, the hard, durable nature of the shell material did offer a practical benefit, reinforcing the mortar's strength, but its true value was not measured in physical resilience alone. It was a spiritual offering, a deliberate act to shield the inhabitants with a favor far greater than stone could provide. This quest for divine sanction was just the beginning, a gentle whisper of faith before builders turned to far more potent and startling mystical defenses. But the quest for a living fortress did not stop with symbolic offerings. At some construction sites, builders took the concept of sacrifice to its most literal and visceral extreme. They would gather buckets of fresh animal blood, often from freshly slaughtered oxen or pigs, and pour the still warm liquid directly into the mortar mix. The paste would churn, transforming from a dull gray into a deep, disturbing crimson. This was not merely a practical additive. It was a profound ritual rooted in the oldest of folk beliefs, the idea that blood held the unique life force, the very soul of a creature. By mixing this essence into the walls, masons believed they were giving the castle a heartbeat. They were creating a fortification that was not just built but born, a living, breathing entity that would actively fight to preserve itself. This symbolic sacrifice was a gift to the land and to the structure itself, a desperate plea for vitality and endurance against any enemy who dared to attack. The logic was hauntingly simple. A wall made with stone and skill could be broken, but a wall fortified with a spirit would actively defend. This dark alchemy, this desire to trap a protective consciousness within stone, would soon push builders to seek out even more potent and personal ingredients for their mystical mortar. Human hair, carefully gathered and kneaded into wet clay, brought the community's own strength into the very heart of the fortress. Picture a basket filled with clippings, collected from the local villagers and even the noble family residing within the castle walls. This was not waste but a precious ingredient. Workers would mix these strands into the daub, the thick clay plaster used to insulate and seal interior walls. The belief was profound. Hair was seen as a powerful repository of a person's vitality and life force. By weaving it into the building's fabric, they were transferring human resilience directly into the stone and timber, making the castle an extension of the people themselves. It was a symbolic act of unity, binding the community's collective spirit into their shared defense. On a purely practical level, the long, fibrous strands acted as a natural reinforcement, much like modern fiberglass, preventing the clay from shrinking and cracking as it dried and hardened. This integration of the human element reveals a deep, almost intimate desire to personalize these massive structures, to fortify them not just with material, but with the very essence of life. This communal effort, where every person could contribute a part of themselves, was just one expression of a broader phenomenon, where the very identity of a place was physically embedded into its foundations. Broken plates and shattered roof tiles found a second life deep within the castle walls. After a meal was finished or a storm had damaged a roof, the fragments were not simply discarded. Medieval builders gathered this ceramic rubble, known as grog, and mixed it into the core of their walls as a rough aggregate. On the surface, this was brilliant, pragmatic recycling, a way to bulk out the wall fill and save on expensive quarried stone. Yet the act carried a meaning far deeper than mere economy. Each piece of pottery was a tangible piece of a story. This shard was from the bowl that held the Lord's stew. That fragment of tile once sheltered the great hall from the rain. By sealing these artifacts of daily life into the fortress, the community was embedding its own history into the stone. The wall became a vast, hidden mosaic of their shared existence, a physical promise of continuity. It was a declaration that the castle was not just a military outpost, but a home, its strength drawn from the memory of every meal shared and every fire lit. This profound connection to the domestic world reveals a culture where nothing was truly waste, and every object held a potential for symbolic power. This resourcefulness extended far beyond the kitchen and the workshop, leading builders to gather potent materials directly from the wild landscape. The mortar itself could become a sacred potion, a mystical blend of bull's blood and fresh milk stirred together in a ritual of profound symbolism. This was no ordinary mixture. The bull, an animal revered for its immense physical power and untamable virility, contributed its vital essence to grant the walls a ferocious, unyielding strength. The fresh milk, in stark contrast, embodied purity, nourishment, and the gentle sustenance of life. By fusing these two opposing forces within the binding matrix of the mortar, the builders were performing a kind of architectural alchemy. They sought to create a fortress that was simultaneously a fierce, masculine defender against all threats and a benevolent, feminine sanctuary for those it sheltered. This was the ultimate balance, a wall that could repel an army with savage force while cradling the lives within with a mother's care. The ritual of mixing these ingredients was as important as their physical properties, a deliberate act to control a dangerous and unpredictable world through symbolic meaning. This deep-seated desire to appease the powerful, unseen forces of the world would lead to even more direct and startling offerings sealed within the stone. For spaces deemed truly sacred, even the mortar was transformed into an offering. In the quiet chapels and private chambers of a lord, builders sometimes mixed their binding paste with two of the medieval world's most precious liquids, honey and wine. This was an act of profound extravagance, a deliberate sacrifice of valuable sustenance for a spiritual cause. Honey, golden and sweet, was a direct symbol of divine favor, prosperity, and the promised blessings of heaven. Wine, deep red and vital, evoked the blood of sacrifice, communion, and sacred celebration. By pouring these treasured commodities into the walls, the builders were not merely constructing a room. They were consecrating it, making a tangible gift to God or the saints, and pleading for their permanent presence and protection over those who worshipped or rested within. While the thick, sticky nature of honey might have slightly improved the mortar's workability, its true purpose was as a fragrant, permanent sacrifice sealed within the stone. This ritual speaks to a powerful belief in divine reciprocity, the idea that a gift of something precious would be met with a far greater blessing in return. Such costly offerings were not made lightly, and this logic of sacred exchange would soon be tested by the use of an even more shocking and permanent material. The kitchen's contribution to castle construction went far beyond feeding the workforce. In great halls and makeshift workshops, servants would crack open thousands of eggs, carefully separating the yolks for cooking and reserving the clear, viscous whites. This substance, known as glaire, was then whisked into the finest plasters and mortars used for detailed work. On a practical level, the protein in the egg whites acted as a powerful natural binder, creating a smoother, harder, and more durable finish that was less prone to cracking. But the true motivation for this costly addition was deeply symbolic. An egg is a universal vessel of life, holding the promise of birth and renewal within its fragile shell. By mixing this essence of potential into the walls, builders were performing a ritual of creation. They were not merely assembling stone, they were attempting to give the fortress a soul, to instill it with a living, breathing quality that would allow it to endure and even regenerate from the wounds of siege and decay. It was an act of profound hope, a belief that the castle, like a dynasty, could be reborn from its own ashes, resilient against the relentless passage of time. This desire to weave the very principle of life into the stonework reveals a mindset where every material choice was a prayer for permanence, a wish to make a mark on the world that would not easily fade. The ultimate permanence was sought not from the earth but from the dead. In a practice that seems chilling to us now, builders would gather vast quantities of animal bones, and on rare, somber occasions, even the remains of fallen warriors from a specific battlefield. These bones were then methodically crushed into a coarse, white powder and stirred into the mortar mix. This was not an act of disrespect, but one of profound reverence. A bone is the very framework of life, the last part of a body to return to the earth. It was the ultimate symbol of endurance, stability, and memory itself. By grinding the bones of a mighty ox or an honored soldier into the walls, the community believed they were transferring that creature's unyielding strength and the fallen warrior's eternal honor directly into the fortress's heart. The castle would thus become a living monument to lineage and sacrifice, its walls forever holding the memory of those who gave their strength in life and in death. This macabre ingredient served as a constant, silent reminder of mortality and the legacy one leaves behind. It was a desperate attempt to make stone as enduring as memory. This deep connection to the essence of life and death, however, was not limited to the animal kingdom, as builders also turned to the resilient spirit of the plant world for a different kind of strength. The golden straw and light chaff left over from the harvest were never wasted. Workers would gather these byproducts and knead them thoroughly into the wet, heavy daub used to fill the spaces in wattle and daub walls. On a purely practical level, these hollow plant fibers were brilliant. They created millions of tiny air pockets, trapping heat in the winter and keeping rooms cool in the summer, while their interlocking strands gave the clay a flexible strength that resisted cracking and crumbling. But the meaning of this simple act went far beyond insulation. Straw was the very symbol of a successful harvest. It was the tangible proof of the land's fertility and the Lord's prosperity. By weaving this bounty directly into the walls of the Great Hall, the builders were performing a powerful, continuous ritual. They were charming the castle, embedding a prayer for endless agricultural wealth and stability into its very fabric. Every wall became a silent testament to the fields that fed the community, a constant reminder that the stone fortress's true power was rooted not in its battlements, but in the fertile soil that surrounded it. The castle did not just oversee the land, it was physically made from it, its walls forever whispering of grain, bread, and the cycle of the seasons. This deep desire to harness the earth's generative power through symbolic materials would soon push builders to seek out substances believed to hold magic of their own. The tale of a prized warhorse was more than a symbol of status, it was a reservoir of its very spirit. When these long, coarse hairs were gathered and mixed into the wet plaster of a castle's great hall or chambers, it was an act of profound symbolism. The warhorse embodied the highest ideals of knighthood, strength, speed, and unwavering loyalty in battle. By weaving its essence into the walls, the builders sought to magically transfer these chivalric virtues to the fortress itself. They believed the castle could become as swift to repel an attack as a charging destroyer, and as unyielding in its defense as the steed that protected its rider. This ritual created a powerful, invisible bond between the stone stronghold and the cavalry that called it home. The knight and his castle were no longer separate entities, but parts of a single, unified defense, forever linked by the hairs of the noble animal that served them both. This deep desire to fuse animal spirit with mineral strength finds an even more mystical expression in the use of a substance believed to be touched by the heavens themselves. Even the stone itself could be enchanted. Laborers would carefully grind clear quartz or other locally sourced crystals into a fine, shimmering dust, then mix this glittering powder directly into the exterior plaster or mortar. This was not for simple decoration. For centuries, crystals have been deeply associated with magic, purity, and the mysterious power of light. In the medieval mind, these stones were believed to actively repel dark energies, evil spirits, and the dreaded evil eye. A castle wall embedded with countless crystal fragments did more than just catch the sunlight. It became a blazing, shimmering shield of spiritual protection, designed to blind, confuse, and deflect any malevolent force that dared to approach. The entire fortress was thus transformed into a giant, community-sized talisman, its every surface charged with defensive magic. This profound belief in the apotropaic power of certain minerals reveals a world where geology was not just a science of the earth, but a source of mystical power where the very rocks underfoot held the potential to guard the soul. This fusion of mineral wealth and magical thinking would lead to the inclusion of a substance so common, yet so symbolically potent, that it was literally scattered at the feet of the gods. The golden oil of the flax plant was more than a simple sealant. Laborers would mix this thick, amber liquid into mortars or painstakingly rub it onto finished stone surfaces, where it would slowly harden into a tough, transparent shield. This was linseed oil, a substance deeply woven into the fabric of daily life through its source. The flax plant gave the world linen, the cloth of light, purity, and domestic comfort. To use its oil in the walls was to invoke all of these peaceful, wholesome qualities for the fortress itself. The act was a powerful ritual of preservation. Just as the oil repelled water and rot from the stone, it was symbolically meant to make the entire castle impermeable. This was a defense not just against the weather, but against the far more dangerous storms of fate, the creeping damp of political intrigue, and the subtle corrosion of spiritual corruption. The Lord desired a household that was not only physically secure but morally and dynastically sealed, a perfect, enduring vessel for his lineage. This relentless search for a perfect barrier, a defense that could stop both sword and curse, would push builders to incorporate substances that created a boundary in the most literal sense imaginable. A special plaster reserved for the most delicate rooms blended the earth's clay with the nourishing power of goat's milk. This was not a mixture for the harsh outer walls, but for the intimate spaces of the nursery or the women's quarters where the castle's future was cradled. The goat itself was a symbol of robust health and stubborn vitality, an animal that could thrive where others faltered. Its milk was considered uniquely pure and strengthening, a potent substance believed to ward off sickness and cleanse a space of negative energies. When mixed into the clay plaster, it was thought to create walls that actively breathed protection into the room, fostering a sanctuary of health that would shield a newborn's first breath or a mother's recovery. This represents a deeply caring, almost medical form of defensive magic, focused not on repelling armies but on banishing the invisible threats of disease and misfortune. It reveals a sophisticated understanding of the home as an ecosystem, where the very air could be charmed for the well-being of its inhabitants. Yet for every space designed to nurture life, there was another intended to aggressively drive spiritual threats away. Iron filings transformed the castle's most vulnerable points into a supernatural battlefield. A blacksmith would save the fine, metallic dust produced from sharpening swords and forging hinges, then deliver these bags of shimmering black powder to the masons. This was no waste product. The workers would carefully blend the iron into the mortar surrounding gateways, window frames, and the narrow slits of arrow loops. Iron was the very substance of human conflict, the material of the knight's sword and the army's armor. Yet in the medieval worldview, its power extended far beyond the physical realm. It was the one metal universally feared by witches, fairies, and all creatures of the unseen world. By embedding this substance into the mortar, builders were raising a potent, invisible barrier. Any malevolent spirit attempting to seep through a gate or window would be met by the repelling force of cold iron, creating a literal magical curtain that evil could not cross. Symbolically, this act projected the aggressive, cutting power of the knight's blade directly onto the static stone. The walls were no longer passive shields, but active defenders charged with the same martial energy as the soldiers who walked their ramparts. Defense became an aggressive, intentional act, a constant state of magical warfare woven into the very fabric of the fortress. This desire to arm the castle with more than just stone would soon manifest in another material, one that protected the stronghold not through silence but through sound. A silent bell held a sacred power long after its final ring. Deep within the foundation stone of a castle, masons would sometimes seal a single, small bell, or more commonly, fragments of a much larger church bell that had cracked. This act was not about discarding broken metal. It was about capturing and preserving a spiritual essence. For the medieval community, the bell's voice was everything. Its daily call structured life itself, marking the hours for prayer, for work, and for rest. More than that, its clear, resonant peal was believed to physically purify the air, shattering the presence of demons and driving away malevolent spirits with its holy vibration. By embedding this metal into the cornerstone, builders were trapping that protective power at the source. The bell did not need to ring to be effective. Its sacred purpose, its history of marking sacred time, was now transferred into the very earth upon which the fortress stood. This silent sentinel hallowed the entire site, transforming the castle from a military stronghold into a permanent bastion of divine order against the ever-encroaching chaos of the world. It was a perpetual, unheard prayer for protection, a constant affirmation that this place was under heaven's watch. This profound need to sanctify space through embedded objects would soon manifest with another religious item, one that carried the weight of a saint's own presence. A sealed cavity within the cornerstone held the ultimate key to divine protection. Here, wrapped in a carefully inscribed sheet of lead, a builder would place a fragment of a saint's bone or a scrap of parchment bearing a sacred prayer. This was not merely a symbolic gesture, it was the deliberate installation of a spiritual power source at the castle's very foundation. The relic served as a direct conduit to heaven, a permanent plea for the saint's intercession that would shield the fortress from both physical and supernatural harm. The lead sheet itself was crucial, chosen not for its beauty but for its enduring nature. Associated with the planet Saturn, a celestial body representing boundaries and eternity, this heavy, stable metal was believed to contain and focus the holy energy of the relic forever, preventing its power from leaking away into the earth. With this single act, the entire castle was transformed. It was no longer just a lord's stronghold, it became a colossal reliquary, a vast container of sacred power that merged the authority of the crown with the ultimate authority of the divine. This represents the absolute peak of a builder's ambition to forge a fortress blessed not just by priests, but by the saints themselves. Yet not every form of protection was drawn from the heights of sanctioned religion. Beyond the chapel and the sacred relic lay the shadowy realm of folk magic, where builders turned to far older and more primal charms to ensure their walls would stand. The walls themselves could breathe a kind of botanical protection, deep within the hollow spaces of a stone wall or carefully kneaded into the damp daub. Workers would place tightly bound bundles of dried sage, rosemary, and rue. This was not an attempt to make the castle smell pleasant. It was the installation of a permanent, invisible defense system rooted in ancient plant lore. Each herb was chosen for its specific, potent symbolic power. Sage was universally respected for its purifying qualities, believed to clear a space of negative energies and grant the wisdom to see through deception. Rosemary, with its enduring fragrance, was the herb of remembrance and fierce loyalty, meant to ensure the inhabitants never forgot their oaths or their lineage. And then there was rue, a bitter plant so strongly associated with repelling witchcraft that it was often called the herb of grace. Its very presence was thought to be toxic to evil spirits, creating a barrier they could not cross. Together, these plants formed a kind of herbal moat against the supernatural, their essences slowly seeping into the castle's atmosphere to perpetually cleanse and guard the rooms. This practice reveals a world where the kitchen garden and the armory were equally important in the defense of the home. The line between a practical medicinal remedy and a potent magical charm was beautifully and deliberately blurred. This deep trust in the protective power of nature would soon lead builders to an even more unexpected source of strength, one drawn not from the soil but from the sea. Rock salt crystals were deliberately scattered like seeds into the foundation trenches of a new castle. This was not a seasoning for the soil, but a profound act of spiritual cleansing. For millennia, salt has been humanity's ultimate symbol of purity and incorruption, a substance so essential it was used to preserve food from rot and to sanctify spaces in religious rites. By burying it beneath the first stones, builders were performing a powerful ritual of purification upon the land itself. They believed the salt would create a permanent zone of spiritual sterility, a barrier so pure that malevolent forces, ancient curses, or chthonic spirits of the underworld could not cross it or take root. The castle would thus be founded upon ground made sacred, a place rendered incorruptible from its very inception. This act reveals a primal fear, the concern that the earth itself might hold old, forgotten malevolence that could seep up into the stone. The salt was a preemptive strike, a way to scorch the spiritual earth before building a heaven-facing fortress upon it. This foundational need to be anchored in purified ground, however, demanded more than just a symbolic cleanse. It required a physical bond with the enduring power of the land itself, a connection builders forged with the most stubborn of materials, charcoal, the blackened bones of a fire, formed a hidden layer beneath the very first stones. Workers would spread this carbonized wood in thick, dark blankets under the foundation or pack it into the substrates of earthen floors. On one level, this was brilliant practical engineering. Charcoal is incredibly porous, acting like a sponge to draw moisture away from the stonework, preventing the insidious damp that could slowly crumble mortar from within. But its purpose was far more profound. This substance was wood that had faced the absolute trial of fire and had not turned to ash. It had been transformed, alchemized from something perishable into a stable, enduring form of pure carbon. By placing it at the foundation, builders were symbolically giving the castle a core that had already survived its own destruction. It was a charm against the slow, creeping death of decay, a declaration that this fortress was built upon a substance that rot could not touch. The charcoal layer was a permanent reminder of resilience, a foundation tested and purified by elemental force. This belief in transformation through fire finds a parallel in another material that changed its state to serve the castle, one that began as a liquid and chose to become stone. The great hall's mortar could bubble with the very spirit of the feast itself. Builders would sometimes take stale ale, a brew past its prime for drinking, and pour it directly into the mortar mix for the walls of this central gathering space. This was no act of waste, but one of profound communal magic. Ale, brewed from the land's barley and consumed by everyone from lord to laborer, was the lifeblood of medieval society. It was the drink of fellowship, of sealed agreements, and of shared celebration after a hard day's work. By cementing it into the great hall's walls, they were physically binding the essence of that camaraderie into the castle's heart. The stone and timber that enclosed the community were now infused with the spirit of the community itself. This transformed the entire space. Every feast held within those walls was now occurring inside a container that had already absorbed the memory of 1,000 such gatherings. The castle's purpose was perfectly balanced, its walls designed as much to nurture the life within as to defy the death without. This celebration of communal life, however, stood in stark contrast to the wild, untamed forces builders also sought to harness from beyond the cultivated fields. Bear grease, thick and pungent, was rubbed into the wooden gates and shutters as a potent charm. This substance, rendered from the heavy fat of a hunted bear, was far more than a simple waterproofing agent. The bear itself was the undisputed monarch of the European forest, a creature revered for its raw physical power, its untamable ferocity, and its fiercely territorial nature. To anoint the castle's timbers with its essence was a deliberate act of symbolic transfer. The builders were not merely preserving wood from rot, they were attempting to infuse the very gates with the bear's wild spirit, hoping to make the defenses as intimidating and unyielding as the beast itself. A gate sealed with bear grease was not just a barrier of oak, but a living, breathing entity that promised a savage, primal defense to any army that approached. This ritual represents a profound desire to harness the raw, chaotic power of the wilderness and bend it to a singular purpose: protection. It reveals a world-view where the line between the civilized stone fortress and the untamed wild was not a border, but a source of strength to be tapped. This belief in transferring the essential character of an animal extends logically to another creature, one whose potent, earthy musk was believed to be just as magically repellent. Urine, collected in vast vats from both animals and the castle's own inhabitants, served a purpose far beyond the merely disgusting. This pungent liquid was a key ingredient in the harsh chemistry of survival. Tanners used its potent ammonia to soften and treat the thick hides destined for siege engines, transforming stiff leather into the flexible, durable covers that protected catapults and battering rams from enemy fire. Elsewhere, it acted as a mordant, helping vibrant pigments bind to the whitewashed walls of the Great Hall. Yet this ultimate recycled material carried a heavy symbolic weight. To incorporate human waste into the very engines of war was an act of profound, defiant pragmatism. It was a statement that the defenders would use everything at their disposal, that even their own basest refuse would be weaponized against the enemy. This was a gesture of contempt, a way of figuratively hurling their waste over the walls at the besieging army long before the first stone was launched. It represented a world where symbolic meaning was forged in the crucible of necessity, where the struggle for survival stripped away all pretense and embraced any advantage, no matter how humble or reviled. This brutal utilitarianism, however, existed alongside a completely opposite desire, one focused not on hidden strength but on the most dazzling and conspicuous display of wealth. A sunlit castle facade could be transformed into a weapon of pure light. Skilled artisans would take broken vessels of green, blue, or clear glass, grinding the shards into a glittering powder to be mixed into the final layer of exterior plaster. When the sun struck this surface, the entire wall would sparkle with 1,000 pinpricks of captured brilliance. In an age where glass itself was a costly luxury, this was far more than simple decoration. It was an ostentatious, undeniable declaration of wealth. A lord who could afford to embed such treasures into his very walls was broadcasting a message of immense power and sophisticated taste to every visitor and rival. But this shimmering display served a far deeper, more mystical purpose. The medieval world believed that malevolent spirits, particularly those of the evil eye, were dangerously fascinated and confused by broken, shimmering light. A sparkling wall did not just announce the owner's status, it actively defended his home. The dazzling facade was designed to mesmerize and disorient any supernatural foe, scattering their malevolent gaze and rendering their curses powerless. This created a perfect union of intimidation and protection, a barrier that blinded both earthly enemies with its splendor and spiritual ones with its magical glare. The command of light as a defensive tool reveals a sophisticated understanding of psychological and mystical warfare, a principle that would be tested in the castle's most volatile and dynamic element. The hearth's ashes were never swept away and forgotten. They were gathered with a sense of reverence, the fine gray dust from a season's worth of fires, and most especially the charred remains of the great Yule log that had burned through the deepest, darkest nights of winter. This was not mere soot to be discarded. When builders mixed these particular ashes into the mortar for a new hearth or chimney, they were performing a ritual of profound continuity. Fire was the living soul of the medieval home, its flickering light a beacon against the cold and dark, its heat the source of cooking, comfort, and life itself. These ashes were the physical essence of that vital force, the tangible proof of all the meals shared, the stories told, and the warmth that had sustained the family. To seal them into the stone of a new fireplace was to magically transplant the very heart of the old household into its new body. It guaranteed that the spirit of the home would not be broken, that the new castle's great hall would inherit the same lively, protective warmth that had defined the family for generations. This act rooted the grandest stone fortress in the most intimate of human experiences, the simple, daily miracle of a shared fire. How far would builders go to ensure this stability was not just emotional but physically unshakable? The answer lies in a substance that refused to move, creating a foundation as stubborn as the will of the lords it supported. Lead crosses were deliberately sealed into the stone at the four corners of a foundation, creating a permanent spiritual bulwark. These small, crudely shaped tokens were not meant to be seen but to work. The cross itself was the ultimate emblem of Christian faith, a plea for redemption and a shield against evil. But the choice of lead was a masterstroke of symbolic engineering. This heavy, stubborn metal does not rust or decay. By casting the sacred form in this enduring substance, builders believed they were literally nailing divine protection to the site, fixing a sacred boundary that evil could not cross. Each doorway, lintel, and cornerstone marked with this hidden symbol transformed the entire castle into a consecrated fortress, its perimeter actively guarded by faith. This was a declaration carved not in stone but in metal, a permanent claim that this land and all within it existed under God's watch. The clarity of this symbol, however, stands in stark contrast to the next material, whose power lay not in a single meaning but in its deep and unsettling ambiguity. A raw animal hide, still heavy with the scent of the forest, was sometimes laid directly upon the earth beneath the castle's cornerstone. This was not leather, tanned and processed for human use, but skin in its most primal state, taken from a powerful bull or a cunning wolf. The ritual was an act of profound sympathetic magic. The hide, being the very boundary between the animal and the world, was seen as a perfect conduit for the earth's own raw power, what some ancient traditions called telluric energy. By placing it at the foundation, builders believed they were plugging the castle directly into this deep, subterranean force. The fortress would draw the stability of the bedrock and the wild, unyielding strength of the beast it came from. It was an attempt to give the building a spirit of territorial defiance, to make it stand its ground with the same instinctive resolve as a wolf defending its den. In this single, visceral act, the castle was given its own skin, a permanent membrane linking the ordered world of stone and mortar to the untamed power of the natural world. This practice whispers of a deep pre-Christian past, a layer of earth magic surviving beneath the surface of medieval Christianity. The desire to anchor a building in the enduring power of the earth, however, could also be satisfied by a substance that was the earth itself, transformed by immense pressure and time. A stone block destined for the castle wall might arrive from the quarry already bearing a mysterious spiral, a coiled shape locked in stone. These fossils, the remains of ammonites and belemnites, were not seen as prehistoric sea creatures. They were snake stones, the petrified remains of serpents turned to stone by a saint's blessing, or thunderbolts, literal weapons hurled from the heavens during divine storms. To carve around them, or better yet, to deliberately place them facing outward in the wall, was to capture a piece of that myth. Each one was a dragon's scale, a giant's tooth, a tangible fragment of a legendary world. By building these relics into the fortress, the masons were not just stacking stone, they were assembling a wall of legends. They believed they were harnessing the ancient, primal power of these mythical beings, channeling the serpent's coiled resilience and the thunderbolt's shattering force directly into the castle's defenses. The fortress thus became an extension of a heroic past, its strength drawn not just from human engineering but from the very bones of the earth's forgotten giants. This mythological interpretation of natural history infused the walls with a narrative power that transcended their physical mass. If a coiled fossil could grant such symbolic might, then a material that was believed to be physically indestructible would offer the ultimate promise of security. The beaver's own body provided a secret ingredient for the master mason's workshop. This animal, a consummate engineer of the natural world, produces a pungent, oily substance called Castoreum. Skilled workers would carefully blend this secretion into specialty plasters or decorative paints, creating a mixture that was far more than a simple binder. The beaver was universally admired for its tireless work ethic and its genius for constructing complex, watertight lodges that could withstand the strongest currents. By incorporating this animal's essence into the castle walls, the builders were attempting a direct transfer of that innate talent. They believed the clever, resilient spirit of the creature would seep into the stone, guiding their hands and ensuring their own workmanship would be as cunning, as adaptable, and as enduring as a beaver's dam. This was not just a wish for strong walls, but for intelligent ones, a charm for a fortress that could outthink its challenges just as much as it could withstand them. It reveals a profound humility, a desire to learn from the master builders of the animal kingdom, and to emulate a perfection that nature had already achieved. If the beaver's ingenuity could be captured in a pot, what material could possibly hold the human dream of immortality itself? A chapel wall could capture the very light of heaven itself. Master artisans would take impossibly thin sheets of gold leaf, carefully flaking them into a shimmering dust before blending this precious powder into the wet plaster of a sacred space. As the surface dried, it would set with a subtle, living luminescence, each tiny fleck of gold catching the candlelight to make the entire wall seem to breathe with a soft, divine radiance. This was not mere decoration, it was a deliberate act of alchemy, transforming a room of stone into a vessel for eternal light. Gold was the metal of the sun, a substance that never tarnished or decayed, and was therefore the ultimate symbol of divinity, purity, and absolute power. A lord who could embed such celestial treasure into his very walls was making a staggering declaration. He was not just wealthy, he was claiming a God-given right to rule, a permanence for his dynasty that mirrored the incorruptible nature of the metal itself. The space became a piece of heaven on earth, a physical manifestation of his piety and his unshakable place in the cosmic order. This breathtaking extravagance represents the absolute peak of using material value to project spiritual and political authority. Yet for every ingredient chosen for its brilliant presence, another was selected for its profound and powerful absence, its protective power lying not in what it was, but in what it deliberately was not. A hollow space left deliberately inside the wall was more than an empty cavity. It was a baited trap, a spiritual snare set for the invisible enemies that haunted the medieval mind. Builders would carefully construct a small, inaccessible void, and within it they would place a potent object known as a witch bottle. This was no ordinary ceramic jar. It was a vessel of counter-magic, typically filled with a disturbing brew of sharp iron nails, human hair, and the caster's own urine. The logic behind this practice was as aggressive as it was terrifying. Malevolent spirits, drawn by an insatiable curiosity, would investigate the dark, confined space and become trapped inside the bottle. There, the contents would work their grim magic. The nails would painfully prick the spirit, the hair would bind and confuse it, and the urine, a powerful substance intimately linked to the person it was meant to protect, created a sympathetic link back to the witch who had sent the haunting. This was not a passive charm meant to ward off evil. It was a weaponized defense, a deliberate act of spiritual retaliation designed to actively capture, torment, and ultimately turn a witch's malice back upon herself. The castle wall was no longer just a barrier. It had become a prison, its very substance charged with the hostile intent of turning dark magic against its source. This shift from shielding to capturing reveals a world view where defense required constant, aggressive action against an unseen world teeming with active threats. It was the ultimate expression of a fortress that did not merely endure but fought back. This final, combative form of protection paves the way for our last material, a substance that sought to unite the raw power of the earth with the divine order of the heavens. The final and perhaps most profound material was iron forged from a stone that fell from the stars. Imagine the sheer improbability of a medieval blacksmith receiving a lump of strange, heavy metal, pitted and scarred from its fiery descent through the atmosphere. This was not ore pulled from the earth, but a meteorite, a gift from the heavens themselves. In an age where the sky was the domain of God and angels, such an object was seen as a direct divine donation, a fragment of the celestial realm sent to earth. The iron within it was considered the purest substance imaginable, forged in the cosmic fires of creation and untouched by the corruption of the mortal world. To take this sacred metal and hammer it into a nail, a clamp, or a decorative boss for the castle gate was the ultimate act of symbolic construction. It was a deliberate, breathtaking claim of divine endorsement. The fortress was no longer just blessed by the church or protected by saints. Its very walls were now physically anchored by heaven's own metal, making the entire structure literally heaven-sent. This was the pinnacle of a builder's ambition, merging the highest spiritual protection with the ultimate physical strength. The celestial iron represented a perfect, unbreakable covenant between the divine and the dynastic, a promise that these walls stood with the absolute authority of the cosmos behind them. And with that final, star-born ingredient, the list of 31 strange materials is complete. Yet the true wonder lies not in the bizarre list itself, but in the unified story these substances tell about the medieval mind, a story where stone and spirit were forever intertwined. Each of these 31 strange materials forms a word in a hidden, unified language. When we step back, a coherent symbolic grammar emerges, a sophisticated system of belief where the physical substance of the castle was in constant dialogue with the spiritual and social realms. We can see three dominant themes woven through every choice. First, the theme of spiritual safeguard, a desperate plea for divine protection. This was achieved not just through prayer, but through the physical embedding of sacred power. Relics, consecrated bells, lead crosses, and even crystal dust were all used to weave a permanent, invisible shield of faith around the fortress, transforming it from a military stronghold into a consecrated bastion against darkness. The second theme is earthly and animal vitality, the profound desire to make the stone come alive. Builders sought to give the castle a heartbeat and a spirit by mixing in the very essence of life itself. Animal blood, human hair, crushed bones, and bare grease were not mere additives. They were attempts to transfer strength, resilience, and a protective consciousness from the living world into the inert mineral, creating a fortress that was not just built but born. Finally, we see the theme of social and political statement, where the walls themselves became a broadcast of power and unity. The glitter of crushed glass, the radiant dust of gold leaf, and the communal essence of ale were all carefully chosen to send an unambiguous message. To a rival lord, they projected immense, unassailable wealth. To the community within, they reinforced a shared identity, cementing their collective spirit into the very mortar that held their home together. This was not a collection of random superstitions. It was a deeply intentional and sophisticated language, a text written in stone, blood, and bone, designed to be read by both friend and foe. To understand this language is to finally hear the whispers of the medieval mind, a world view where every stone told a story of faith, life, and power.